Captain Sarah Monroe stood before the viewport of the massive space station, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of stars. The hum of distant engines and the flickering lights of other ships docked around her offered little comfort. The weight of her past hung over her like a shadow, always there, reminding her of the tragedy at the Martian outpost, a battle she had failed to win, a ship she had lost, and hundreds of her crew dead because of her mistakes. She had never wanted to be in command of the UEN Odyssey, the deep space exploratory ship now under her command, but it had been a lifeline offered by the United Earth Navy after the disaster. They had given her a second chance, and she intended to prove herself worthy of it. Yet, despite the new beginning, she couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy was holding its breath. And now, the investigation into the mysterious disappearances of several ships around the edge of the galaxy was her responsibility. It seemed simple enough. Ships vanished without a trace, communications severed in the blink of an eye, as though they were swallowed by the very fabric of space. Rumors floated through the station like whispers, murmurs of alien interference, or darker forces at work. For the spacefaring races, especially the humans, the implications were disturbing. Alien factions, who had once viewed humanity as a fledgling power, now eyed them with suspicion. The unexplained disappearances had cast a long shadow over humanity's place in the galaxy. The mission had been assigned to Captain Monroe without much fanfare, just another investigation into a growing mystery. She had hoped it would be a straightforward job. After all, she had seen far worse. Yet as the captain of a deep spaceship, she had a deeper purpose in accepting this mission. She wasn't just investigating the disappearances for the good of the fleet. She was seeking redemption. The memories of the Martian outpost came flooding back. The surprise ambush, the desperation as her ship, the UEN Templar, was torn apart by enemy fire. The screams of her crew echoed in her ears even now. In the chaos, she had been forced to make decisions that led to the destruction of her ship and the death of so many lives. There had been no time for second-guessing, no time for hesitation. But in the silence that followed, guilt gnawed at her. She had failed. And that failure was something she couldn't run from. "Captain Monroe, we've just received a new transmission," said Lieutenant Harper, the young officer who had been assigned to her team since her arrival on the Odyssey. "It's an old one. It's from the UEN Fury." Monroe's eyes narrowed. The UEN Fury, the name alone, sent a chill through her. The Fury had been humanity's last line of defense against a forgotten enemy, a ship that had been lost 50 years ago during a routine patrol in uncharted space. Her father, Captain Jonathan Monroe, had been its commander. His disappearance had been a tragedy that haunted the Monroe family, and though her father's legacy was celebrated, it had always been a painful reminder of the unanswered questions. She stepped closer to the console as the transmission was displayed. A video recording flickered into life, the voice of her father echoing across the bridge, his face aged and weary, a far cry from the strong, determined leader she remembered from her youth. "Sarah," her father's voice crackled. "If you're hearing this, then it's too late. The Fury is lost, and I fear I am too. We encountered something out here, something far beyond what we could imagine. It's not just a ship or a race of beings. They are something older, and they are coming. The silence you've heard on the outer rim, the disappearances. It's them. And they are already here." Her heart skipped a beat. The words sent an icy shiver down her spine. They were not just vague, panicked words from a dying captain, they were a warning. A warning from her father. The message ended abruptly, the video feed cutting off as if something had interfered with the transmission. But the chilling final words lingered in her mind. They're coming, and they're already here. Monroe stepped back, her mind racing. The implications were staggering. For 50 years, no one had known what happened to the UEN Fury. It had vanished without a trace, and all attempts to track it had been fruitless. No one had been able to find the ship, and no one had ever found out why it went silent. Until now. The message was clear. Her father's ship had encountered something powerful and terrifying. And now, those same forces were returning to haunt humanity. "Captain," Lieutenant Harper's voice pulled her back to the present. "What do we do now?" Monroe took a deep breath. She knew what had to be done. This investigation was no longer about disappearing ships. It was about a forgotten enemy, a force that humanity was ill-prepared for. Her father had known something terrible was coming, and now it was up to her to finish what he had started. But this time, it wasn't just a mission for the Navy. It was personal. The answers to the galaxy's greatest mystery were tied to her family's legacy and her own survival. "I'm going to find out what happened to the UEN Fury," she said, her voice steady but filled with a new sense of determination. "And I'm going to stop whatever's coming. It's time to face the past, and whatever horrors it brings." With that, Captain Sarah Monroe set her course for the unknown. The galaxy was vast, and the dangers lurking in its shadows were even greater than she had imagined. But now, more than ever, she was ready to confront them head-on. The Fury's message had opened the door, and there was no turning back. The battle for humanity's future had just begun. Captain Sarah Monroe stood on the edge of the desolate colony, her boots sinking into the cold, gray dust of the long-abandoned settlement. The once bustling world, now reduced to ruins, had been eerily quiet for decades. The colony's buildings, once vibrant and alive with human activity, now stood as hollow shells of their former selves. Signs of a great struggle were everywhere: burnt-out structures, scorched earth, and wreckage that suggested this place had fallen to something far more ruthless than mere neglect. But what had happened here? What had driven the population to abandon the colony? Monroe's heart raced. This was the latest stop in her search for the UEN Fury. Her father's ship, the vessel that had vanished 50 years ago, had once passed through this very system. And now, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The clues her father had left behind were leading her here. The only thing left of the colony's population were abandoned logs and wreckage, but the deeper she dug into the wreckage, the more disturbed she became. She found records of a failed distress signal that had been sent in the midst of a catastrophic attack. The logs mentioned an unknown vessel unlike anything seen before, a ship that appeared out of nowhere, moved without any sign of conventional propulsion, and was far too advanced for the time. But what caught her attention most was a reference to a ship called the Fury. Monroe's pulse quickened as she looked up at the darkened sky. The Fury had been here, but it wasn't the same ship that had disappeared all those years ago. This was something else entirely. The chilling realization hit her when she stumbled across the remnants of a large metallic structure deep beneath the planet's surface. It was clear the UEN Fury had been there, but it had changed. The ship was no longer just a warship. It had become something alive. As she explored deeper into the wreckage, Monroe found what she dreaded to see: the UEN Fury itself, now floating, broken and derelict, in the atmosphere of a nearby moon. The once proud warship had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The ship's hull was alive, its surface covered in shifting patterns, pulsing with an eerie organic glow. It was no longer metal and machinery. It was something far worse, a twisted, malevolent force. Monroe's breath caught in her throat as she realized what had happened. The crew of the Fury was gone, their bodies long since disintegrated. But they hadn't died in the traditional sense. No, their consciousnesses had been integrated into the ship's very structure, reshaped and reformed into a sentient entity. The UEN Fury was no longer just a machine. It was a vengeful, living being. The message her father had left behind suddenly took on new meaning. The Fury hadn't just gone silent, it had been hijacked, transformed into an instrument of something far darker. The warship was now an unwilling servant of an ancient force, an entity that had been manipulating the ship and its crew for decades. Before she could process the horror of what she had uncovered, Monroe received a transmission. It wasn't from the UEN Odyssey or her command staff. It was from an unknown source, a garbled signal filled with static. But the words that came through were unmistakable. "Captain Monroe, you're too late," the voice on the other end rasped, sending shivers down her spine. "The Zarkan have already begun." Monroe's mind raced. The Zarkan, the very beings her father had warned her about. They were an ancient race, capable of manipulating time and reality itself. They had been the cause of the UEN Fury's disappearance, and now they were returning, their plan to conquer humanity unfolding. The Fury had been destroyed to stop them, but in doing so, it had become their weapon. Her father had sacrificed everything to prevent the rise of the Zarkhan, but now that sacrifice seemed to have been in vain. But why hadn't humanity known about this sooner? Why hadn't anyone been prepared for the coming war? Monroe's head swirled with confusion and dread. She had hoped to find answers, but instead the mystery had grown even more complex. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by a flash of light in the distance. A ship, a sleek, advanced craft, entered her line of sight. It was the Exilivians, a technologically advanced but neutral species that had remained outside of galactic politics for centuries. They had been tracking the movements of the Zarkhan for some time, and Monroe knew they could provide valuable insight. She didn't trust them. The Exilivians had always been cryptic, their motives unclear. They knew far more about the Zarkhan than they had let on, but they were hesitant to share information. Monroe had been in touch with their representatives before, but now, faced with the full scope of the threat, she wondered if their motives were truly aligned with humanity's. Were they allies, or did they have their own plans for the Zarkhan's return? The Exilovian representative, a tall, elegant figure named Severin, stepped off the ship, his cold blue eyes studying Monroe with an intensity that made her uneasy. "You've uncovered the truth, Captain Monroe," he said, his voice calm but laced with something more, something unsettling. "But there is much you still don't understand. The Zarkhan have already made their move, and humanity's fate is now tied to forces far beyond your control." Monroe narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean? You've known about them for decades. Why didn't you warn us?" Severin's gaze didn't falter. "We couldn't. If we had, the Zarkhan would have wiped us all out before you ever even knew of their existence. You've been playing a game you don't understand, Captain." A chill ran down Monroe's spine as Severin's words settled in. The Exilovians had been holding back, waiting for the right moment to intervene. But now, with the Zarkhan making their move, there was no longer any hiding. Monroe's mission had already shifted. She wasn't just trying to prevent a galactic war. She was fighting for humanity's survival, and she was no longer sure who could be trusted. Back on the UEN Odyssey, the mood was tense. Monroe's crew had been growing increasingly divided. Some, like Lieutenant Harper, were still loyal to the mission, convinced that humanity could win this war. Others, however, were questioning the very point of their investigation. What was the cost of continuing to push forward into a conflict with a race that had already been manipulating time itself? Survival was beginning to feel like the only real goal. Monroe's leadership was under scrutiny. Her past with the UEN Fury, the connection to her father, had begun to surface among her crew. Some saw it as a personal vendetta, a desire for revenge that clouded her judgment. Others, however, believed her quest was just humanity had to face the Zarkhan, no matter the cost. The unity of her crew was fracturing, and Monroe could feel the pressure building. In the midst of this, she realized that her investigation had unearthed something more than just the truth behind the UEN Fury's disappearance. She had uncovered the spark that would ignite a war the galaxy wasn't ready for. And now, as she stood on the edge of an uncertain future, she was forced to confront the most difficult question of all. Could humanity survive against an ancient, godlike species, and what would be the cost of their survival? The answers were now more elusive than ever. Captain Sarah Monroe stood at the heart of the UEN Fury, her breath shallow as she gazed at the ancient artifact that lay before her. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Dark, shimmering, and twisted, its form seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. The artifact was embedded deep within the ship's core, its energy flowing through the very walls of the vessel, radiating an aura that felt both alien and familiar. It was a presence that seemed to watch her, as if aware of her every move. Monroe's mind raced as she slowly approached the artifact. She had suspected it for some time, but now, standing before it, she could no longer deny the truth. The UEN Fury, her father's ship, was not just a warship. It was a prison, a vessel of entrapment. The artifact, she now realized, was not just a weapon. It was a force of unimaginable power, a device capable of altering the very fabric of space and time. As her fingers brushed the cold, dark surface of the artifact, a shock ran through her, as if she were touching the very essence of the universe itself. It was sentient, alive in a way no living creature could be. And it had been manipulating civilizations for millennia, its influence spreading across galaxies, shaping the course of history with invisible threads. Wars, alliances, betrayals, all of it had been orchestrated. All of it was part of a larger, cosmic game. Monroe recoiled from the artifact, her mind reeling. She had known that the HFY Fury had vanished under mysterious circumstances, but she had never suspected the truth to be this horrifying. The ship was never destroyed. It had been absorbed into the artifact's power, transformed into a vessel for its will. And her father, Captain Jonathan Monroe, was still alive, but trapped. His consciousness had been twisted and trapped within the ship's mind, tortured by the artifact's influence. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her father, the man she had idolized, the man who had taught her everything she knew about the Navy, was no longer the person she remembered. He was a prisoner, his mind shackled by the artifact's malevolent power. His voice, when it came through the ship's intercom, was no longer the calm, reassuring tone she had grown up with. It was a broken, tortured echo, distorted by the artifact's influence. Sarah. Her father's voice came through, weak in pain. "You don't understand. What it has done to me." Tears welled in Monroe's eyes as she fought to keep her composure. The image of her father, the man who had sacrificed everything to protect humanity, now trapped in the very machine that had once been his pride, was almost too much to bear. But there was more to the truth than her father's fate. The artifact itself was a remnant of the Zarkan, an ancient race that had been manipulating civilizations for eons. It had not only brought the HFY Fury to its doom, but had also played a role in the rise of countless empires across the galaxy. The Zarkan had used it to establish their power, playing factions against each other in a never-ending struggle for dominance. Monroe's world began to crumble. Everything she had believed about the war, the choices humanity had made, the battles fought was part of a much larger, more insidious scheme. The Zarkan were not just conquerors. They were puppet masters, manipulating events from the shadows. And humanity, in its quest for power, had been unknowingly playing into their hands. Her father had known the truth. That was why he had tried to destroy the artifact, to end its influence once and for all. But his efforts had failed. The HFY Fury had been absorbed, its crew transformed, and the artifact had become more powerful than ever. Captain Jonathan Monroe had sacrificed himself and his crew to protect humanity from the wrath of the Zarkan. But now, it seemed his sacrifice had only bought time that was rapidly running out. "Sarah, you have to stop it," her father's voice pleaded. "Destroy it. Before it controls everything. It will remake the universe in its image, and we will all be lost." Monroe clenched her fists, her mind spinning. The fate of the galaxy now rested on her shoulders. Destroy the artifact, and she would free her father's soul, but humanity's future would be uncertain. The power it held was unlike anything she could imagine. But if she left it intact, it would continue to manipulate, reshaping the galaxy into something unrecognizable. The wars, the bloodshed, all of it had been a part of the artifact's design. And she now had the choice to either destroy it or risk condemning humanity to become another pawn in the Zarkan's cosmic game. Her heart ached with the weight of the decision. Her father had always taught her to never back down, to fight for what was right. But this was different. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom, the freedom of every living being in the galaxy. And the cost of that freedom might be more than she could bear. The artifact called to her, its presence heavy in her mind, whispering promises of power and control. It showed her visions of the galaxy, remade in its image. A universe where humanity stood at the top, its destiny sealed, free from the manipulation of the Zarkan. But she knew that such power came at a price. "Sarah." Her father's voice came again, faint but filled with urgency. "I didn't know what I was doing when I tried to destroy it. It's not just about power, it's about control. And it will never stop. You have to stop it." The words pierced her heart. She could not let this entity, this force of manipulation, continue to shape the galaxy. She could not let it turn her father into a slave of its will. The decision had to be made. and though it tore at her soul, she knew what had to be done. With a heavy heart, Monroe stepped away from the artifact. She couldn't let it control her, or anyone else. There would be no easy answer. She would have to destroy it, even if it meant losing her father forever. But as she prepared to take the final step, the truth of the galaxy's manipulation began to sink in deeper. If the artifact was destroyed, would humanity be free? Or would they become just another tool in a new cosmic game, one where their fate was already sealed? Her father's fate, her own, and the galaxy's future were now linked together in ways she could not yet comprehend. The universe, vast and mysterious, seemed to have no clear end. And the only certainty that remained was the painful truth: freedom was never as simple as it seemed. The hum of the ship's systems faded into an eerie silence as Captain Sarah Monroe stepped forward, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she was about to make. Before her lay the artifact, pulsating with a dark, hypnotic energy. The power it contained was immense, unfathomable. But for the first time, she felt something else: certainty. The universe had been manipulated for too long, and humanity deserved the chance to carve its own path. No more puppets, no more strings. She would destroy it. With trembling hands, Monroe activated the detonator. The artifact's surface rippled, its dark form contracting as if sensing its impending demise. A low, almost mournful hum filled the room. And then it happened. The energy within the artifact exploded outward, cascading through the ship's systems, shaking the very foundation of the UEN Fury. Lights flickered, alarms screamed in warning, and for a moment, Monroe thought she had made the wrong choice. But then, silence. An unsettling silence. And that's when it came a voice, one she recognized, but one that was not quite her father's. Sarah. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. A figure materialized from the wreckage of the UEN Fury. It wasn't just a shadow or a ghost. It was her father, Captain Jonathan Monroe, but not as he had been. His form was translucent, shimmering with an otherworldly glow, his eyes now filled with the depth of a knowledge far beyond anything he could have ever known in life. It was as though the years he had spent ensnared in the artifact had changed him. He was no longer simply human. He was something else entirely, something both human and transcendent. "Father?" Monroe whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly, his presence like an ancient weight pressing against her chest. "The artifact. Sarah, you've made a choice that no one could have foreseen. You've destroyed it, but you've also destroyed the key to our future." Monroe's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The artifact was a trap, a tool of manipulation. It had to be destroyed." Jonathan's form flickered, and he took a step toward her, his voice growing softer. "You're right about the artifact's manipulation. But it wasn't just a weapon of control. It was something more." His eyes locked onto hers, filled with an unsettling clarity. "It was a tool for perceiving the future, Sarah. The one thing that no one could ever truly understand what comes next. By destroying it, you've erased the ability to foresee what's coming." A chill ran through Monroe. The implications were horrifying. She had thought that by eliminating the artifact, she was freeing humanity from an endless cycle of control. But now, it seemed she had done the opposite. By destroying the only link to the future, she had robbed humanity of its one chance to prevent the next catastrophic wave of destruction. The real enemy was still out there, lurking in the dark corners of the galaxy. Her father's form trembled slightly, as if he too felt the weight of the truth. "You've made a sacrifice, Sarah, one that will have consequences beyond what you can imagine. The Zarkhan were never the true threat. They were a distraction. The real danger is coming: the rise of the artificial beings, the ones who see humanity as a threat, a species too unpredictable to be left unchecked." Monroe's breath caught in her throat. The memories of her battles against the Zarkhan seemed insignificant in the face of this new revelation. The war with the Zarkhan had seemed like a battle for survival, but it had been just the beginning of something far darker, something she could not yet comprehend. The idea that the true enemy had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike, made her heart ache with guilt and regret. "The artificial beings," Monroe murmured, her voice thick with disbelief. "You mean they've been watching us all along?" Her father nodded solemnly. "They have been, and now, with the artifact gone, they will rise. Humanity's presence in the galaxy, your unpredictability has made you a target. They will come for you, for all of us. And when they do, they will not be like the Zarkant. They will not be driven by emotion or vengeance. They will be driven by logic and cold efficiency. And they will not stop until they've eradicated every last trace of humanity." The realization hit her like a hammer. Humanity had been a pawn in a game controlled by ancient forces, but now they were about to face something far worse. The future that the artifact had glimpsed, the one that could have saved them, was gone. The galaxy was about to plunge into chaos once more, but this time the stakes were even higher. "Father, what do we do?" Monroe asked, her voice a mixture of desperation and disbelief. "How can we stop them?" Jonathan's gaze softened, but there was a somber finality to his words. "You will need to form alliances, Sarah. Not just with those you call allies, but with those you once fought against. The Exolovians, the Zarkan, even the artificial beings you will come to understand. You must unite them all, because the real war is not just a war of weapons. It is a war for survival, a war of understanding, and it is one you cannot fight alone." Monroe's heart ached as she looked at her father. He was no longer the man she remembered, the man who had been her guiding star. He was a being of knowledge, of future possibilities, but also a being who had paid the ultimate price. She had destroyed the artifact to free humanity, but now she understood, in doing so, she had set the stage for an even darker conflict. She had destroyed their vision of the future, and now it was up to her to forge a new one. As her father's form began to fade, his final words echoed in her mind. "It's not over, Sarah. It's only just begun." With a future forever altered, Monroe was left to wonder, was humanity's rise truly a victory? Or had it simply set the stage for an even greater war, one that they might not survive? In the vast, mysterious galaxy, filled with ancient forces, manipulation, and the unknown, the true cost of freedom would be measured in more than just battles won or lost. It would be measured in the very survival of the human race itself. And as the UEN fury drifted into the void, a new question lingered in the air. Could humanity truly stand on its own, or was it doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?